Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you very much for inviting me to give this presentation. It's a great honor to be giving this talk for Joep Lange, who is my PhD supervisor. I started working with Joep and David in the early 1990s, and you look at all the little decisions, all the big decisions they've made over the last 20, 30 years. There's a history of HIV that's never been written, and part of that history is these people working quietly, diplomatically, with all these different pharmaceutical companies, with governments, making these key decisions that without which we simply wouldn't have 22 million people on treatment. They've always been brave, adventurous, but remained scientific at the same time. And one thing people might not know about, I'll just talk about David for a moment. He also had a love of karaoke and disco dancing. This is him at one of the HIV-NAT retreats. So one of my earliest memories of David was I was at a meeting about 3TC with a company called Glaxo Wellcome in 1992, and they were about to shut down the factories. They were going to stop developing it. And he's normally such a mellow guy. He's always so sort of quiet and self-assuming. And he really piped up and he said, "You've got to develop this drug. It's highly synergistic with AZT. It's very safe. It's virologically potent. You've got to do it." And this company that was just going to shut down 3TC actually decided to keep it going. And it's all these little decisions that have got us where we are now. If you look at, Joep, I've worked with him, again, on many different occasions over the last 20 years. And we think about where we were in 1998 when the first HIV-NAT Symposium was set up. Back then, and this is just after 1999, the World Bank was saying that treatment for HIV is just too expensive. It's going to cost $10,000 per person per year, and so we can't treat Africa. And it's not feasible, and they're going to die, and we have to have bereavement counseling to alleviate this terrible suffering that's going to happen. Now, I went to see Joep in his clinic in Amsterdam in late 99. There was a total eclipse of the sun. I remember it so clearly. And we went through these different drugs and what they actually cost to make. I had some inside information about some of the non-nucleosides. He knew about some of the other drugs. And we worked out back then in August 99 that you could treat somebody with HIV for about $500 US. And then Joep and David set up the Pharma Access Foundation to make sure that drugs could be developed and produced cheaply. And if it wasn't for decisions like this that people like Joep and David had made, we simply wouldn't have had that ability to start upscaling treatment. And it was Joep who first said, if you can get a can of Coke or a bottle of beer to anybody in any country in Africa or other low-income countries, you can get them drugs. And why should we not be doing this? It was quite a defiant statement at the time. And I think the other thing we should remember is there has been a huge fight. This is not a birthright that we've got where we are. If you look at the Durban AIDS conference in the year 2000, when the pharmaceutical companies actually took the South African government to court because they were trying to import generic medicines to treat HIV, it was people, again, like Joep and David who were behind that, making sure that this was forced through and that justice was served for people with HIV. You look at how far we've come. Back in 2000, the idea of putting 20 million people on treatment was just impossible. Nobody believed it could happen. And now we have 59% of people with HIV on treatment. I think it's fair to say it's one of the great miracles of modern medicine that we've got this far. But what I'm going to talk about in the rest of my talk is how much further can we take it? How can we continue this legacy and get treatment for everybody? So if we look at what are called the UNAIDS 90-90-90 targets, so getting 90% of people diagnosed, 90% of them treated, and 90% with viral suppression, where are we at the moment? We have about 28 million people diagnosed. 3/4 of people with HIV have been diagnosed. 59% have been treated, and about half have viral suppression. Now, what do we need to do to get to these 90-90-90 targets? We need to diagnose another 5 million people, get another 8 million people on treatment, and then get 9.3 million people virally suppressed. These targets are set to increase over time to these 95 targets. And in that case, we'd need to get another 8 million people diagnosed, 12 million people on ART, and another 14 million people virally suppressed. So we actually have a long way to go, even though we shouldn't just think that this is impossible. I remember you was a very keen marathon runner, and when you run marathons, there's part of the psychology where you're 21 kilometers into a 42-kilometer race, and you have to kind of celebrate where you are at the time and think, well, I've got this far, I can actually make it. And I think their vision throughout the years has helped people keep going, because I think some people just think they can give up and think that that's enough, but it's amazing how far we've come. I think we can achieve this. But one thing that strikes me when you look at coverage and who's actually reached these goals is there is so much diversity worldwide. You can't just say this is the percentage of people on treatment in Africa. It depends which part of Africa you're in. And even within regions, you'll get differences. If you look at Southeast Asia, you look at Cambodia and Thailand, which are doing extremely well, versus Indonesia nearby, which is not having good progress. You look at the countries which have already achieved the 90-90-90 goal, and they're all over the world. There's no hard and fast rule. It's not like the rich countries are doing well and the poor countries are not. You've got the Netherlands, UK, Denmark. In southern Africa, you've got Eswatini, Botswana, you've got Cambodia. Thailand is close. Thailand is on 72% of people with HIV on treatment, and Australia has hit 82%. So I think this shows this can be done anywhere, but there are countries being left behind. And what I'm going to talk about just for a moment is, why is this? Why are some countries doing so well, and yet other countries really falling behind? Now, the first thing that comes in here is in terms of regions. And if you look at the different parts of the world, you've got Western Europe, 77% of people with HIV on treatment. East and Southern Africa is doing extremely well. But remember, in East and Southern Africa, you have very targeted funding from the American government, PEPFAR. And so there's huge support for people to be diagnosed and put on treatment. Then Latin America on 61%, the Caribbean on 58%, Asia Pacific 52%. But remember the diversity there. You've got Cambodia doing very well, Thailand, Australia, but other countries falling behind. Then you've got Eastern Europe and Central Asia, Russia doing really, really poorly. Western Central Africa, so you contrast East and Southern Africa 66% with Western Central Africa on 39%, and then finally you've got the Middle East and North Africa down on 29%. But let's look in a little bit more detail. Let's see what else is going on here. So then when you look at the prevalence of HIV, so are there countries which have so much HIV, so many people with HIV, that they see it as a burden and they'll prioritize it, and other countries where the prevalence is so low that it's kind of out of sight and out of mind? If we divide the HIV epidemic approximately into two halves, you've got 18.6 million people in 12 high prevalence countries with a prevalence of HIV above 4.5%, and they're all concentrated in Eastern and Southern Africa. And then the other half of the epidemic, and that's in orange, the other half of the epidemic is marked in yellow here. You've got 44 countries with under 4.5% prevalence, and there you've got 15.1 million people living with HIV. But they're mainly outside sub-Saharan Africa. A lot of the countries are richer. Now, how does that affect access to medicine and measures of success? So in these graphs I'm going to show you, on the y-axis you've got a measure of treatment coverage. So the higher you are, the better. This is the percentage of people taking ARVs, and each dot is a country. And then on the x-axis you've got prevalence. So you can see the dark green countries, these are countries with higher prevalence, above 4.5%, and you can see that they all have estimated ARV coverage of at least 50%. The Botswana, Lesotho, Swaziland, South Africa, Mozambique, Zambia, Malawi, Uganda, Kenya, Rwanda, all these classic countries with heavy support from the Global Fund, from PEPFAR, a lot of attention put on them. And then if you look at the lower prevalence countries, you've got this huge diversity. You've got some countries doing extremely well. You've got Cambodia, Rwanda, Burundi in the top left, low prevalence, but they're putting a lot of attention onto HIV. But the big problem now with treatment coverage is the countries in this dotted red circle. So these are countries with lower prevalence and are just not reaching these targets, not anywhere near countries like Iran, Angola, Central African Republic, the Philippines, Côte d'Ivoire, Cameroon, Dominican Republic, Sudan, Pakistan. And that's ARVs for adults. And then let's look at ARVs in children. You've got the same pattern. So in these countries in East Africa, in South Africa, children are being treated. Swaziland, again, Zimbabwe doing very well, Kenya doing very well, but they have this high prevalence, high levels of donor support. You look at treatment in children in the Philippines, in Equatorial Guinea, Cameroon, Côte d'Ivoire. You've got this concentration in the bottom left. This is where the problem is. This is why we're not reaching these targets worldwide. And then finally, if you look at pregnant women, you would think that with all the evidence supporting treatment of pregnant women, that the vast majority of women with HIV would be tested and treated. And indeed, that is happening in the higher prevalence countries. Again, South Africa, Zimbabwe, Namibia, all those countries are doing very well at around 90% of pregnant women being diagnosed and treated. But then you look at a country like Guatemala, 20% of pregnant women have been tested and treated. Nigeria, Congo, Sudan, Pakistan. Now, what does that all mean for the trajectory of the epidemic? So if we look at these two categories, we've got our higher prevalence countries, 12 of them, 16.6 million people infected, and the lower prevalence countries, under 4.5%, 44 countries, but a slightly smaller epidemic. But this is the line for dividing lower and higher prevalence. So if you look at the total percentage of people on ART in the higher prevalence countries, it's 67% versus 47% in the lower prevalence countries. Children on ART, 2/3 in the higher prevalence countries, but just over a quarter in the lower prevalence countries. Pregnant women on ART, 91% in higher prevalence, 53% in lower prevalence. And then what does that mean for new infections and AIDS-related deaths? It actually means that most new HIV infections are now not happening in the classic African countries. They're happening in the countries like Indonesia, in Russia, in Dominican Republic, all these countries you've never even thought of, because they're not on the radar of the big donor organizations. They're not getting the funding. They're not seeing it as a priority. And actually, 2/3 of HIV-related deaths are happening outside the high prevalence countries at the moment. And then another big predictor that people don't really talk about, you can say, well, why is this country not treating large numbers of people? We've looked at a measure from the United Nations called the Global Peace Index that measures military conflict, civil unrest, and civil war. And actually, if you correlate treatment coverage with the Global Peace Index, you get a very strong correlation. This graph is a little bit hard to see for the individual countries, but you can see in the top left, the countries, little dots in blue, the most peaceful countries in the world, countries like Sweden or Switzerland, having very high rates of treatment coverage. And then the countries right in the bottom right, with the worst civil unrest, civil war, countries like Afghanistan, South Sudan, Somalia, with extremely low levels of coverage. And it's hard to see how these countries, with all the problems they have, how actually they can make progress. But if you look at two examples, you look at Somalia, even in those countries where they have so many problems with military conflict and unrest, the percentage of people on treatment in Somalia has risen from 6% in 2010 up to 28% in 2017. So there is progress being made, even though they're not getting to the kind of levels that we would see in other places. And then South Sudan, going from 1% in 2010 up to 13% in 2017, despite all of the civil unrest, the wars. So I think it shows that progress can be made, but we've got to be humble. We've got to think about all these countries that we're not normally reporting on. You'll go to a CROI, you'll go to a big conference, and people will talk about progress in Zimbabwe, in South Africa, in Kenya, Tanzania. We need to hear more about what's happening to these countries who are being left behind, who have a low prevalence, who have military conflict. There's a final aspect that Peter touched on earlier on, and it's about reaching the missing people. And really, to get to that final 10%, there are countries like Thailand that have led the way in outreach work, as finding people who are too embarrassed or too scared to come forward and get tested. They fear being deported, being made unemployed. They don't know what treatment could do for them. And actually, these people are not dying of AIDS, they're dying of stigma, they're dying of shame. But I think these outreach worker programs happening in a whole variety of countries are going to help. And when we ran the Living and Loving charity over 10 years, we saw incredible benefits from treatment. We started off with, we had 124 HIV-infected children, and at the end of the program we had 122. Very, very few people died if they were being looked after. But we had all these terrible stories about women who sold silk, for example, people not buying the silk off them because they had HIV and having to find any employment they could, of buildings being divided in half, the HIV-positive part of the building, the HIV-negative part, of children not being allowed into school because they had HIV. And I think it's the power of these social workers, outreach workers, really trying to fight the corner for people with HIV that really helps them to be braver and come forward and get treated. Now, if we look at the size of the HIV epidemic worldwide, you would think that with all of this testing, all of this treating, that the incidence would be coming down and we'd be getting control of the epidemic. What a lot of people don't really talk about is actually the epidemic continues to rise year after year. And the target of reaching 500,000 HIV infections a year by 2020 simply is not going to be met. We're still way above that. So the number of people on ART is rising, and it's gone up to 21.7 million, but the epidemic is also rising. And how can we tackle that? So if you look at this schematically, we have every year 1.8 million new HIV infections, and then 0.9 million HIV-related deaths. So you can see that the epidemic will continue to rise unless we can stop these infections from happening. So I was asked to answer this question, how close are we to treatment for all? If every year we have to put another person on treatment and then another person's infected, it's like a cat chasing their tail, round and round. We never get there. We've got to stop these new HIV infections from happening to actually get to 90-90-90 reliably across a range of different countries. Remember that every 17 seconds worldwide, somebody is infected with HIV, and this is just going on and on every year. And as I said, the low prevalence countries where they have low coverage, that's where the infections are happening. And if you look at the regions of the world which are not treating many people, they're actually getting year on year more and more infections. You look at Middle East and North Africa, where if you compare 2017 with 2010, 12% more people a year are getting infected. Remember, the UNAIDS target is to get a 75% reduction between 2010 and 2020. These people are showing a rise. You look at Eastern Europe and Central Asia, 29% more people are being infected every year in 2017 compared to 2010. That is so far away from the UNAIDS target, and things really need to change. Even in Eastern and Southern Africa and West Europe, North America, the reductions at a national level are just not that impressive. So I think what we need to really be thinking about, and this is an expression we've started to coin, is what's called throwing the kitchen sink at HIV. Now, I don't know if that's an expression in Thailand, but in Britain, if you throw the kitchen sink at something, you do everything you possibly can. So you get people diagnosed, high rates of HIV testing, treating everybody, rapid uptake of ART, PrEP available, regular monitoring, combination prevention techniques. You just do absolutely everything you can. Linda Gale Becker has spoken about this and has said that sometimes you're doing so much, you don't actually know which aspect of throwing the kitchen sink of HIV is the most important factor. But that shouldn't stop you doing it. I think what we are seeing is that countries that are doing this are showing reductions in HIV incidence that are quite striking and unprecedented. Peter was talking earlier about the reductions in the Netherlands. This is a clinic I work in central London, where in 2015, 72 people a month were coming in, new HIV diagnoses. And they put in this very intensive program of anybody who wanted PrEP could get it. No questions asked. No questions asked. People could get PEP if they wanted it, expanded testing, treating everybody potentially the same day, earlier treatment starts, all sorts of combination prevention, no judgment involved. And there was a news program that went out on British television about how people would access the treatments. We have buyers clubs because the tenofovir from Gilead is so expensive. We get people to import the drug through the internet, and we've been bringing drug in to the UK as a generic to break the patent. And it's very important to have a pragmatic solution. If cost is getting in the way, just to get around it, it's completely legal. And we've been bringing drugs in for several years now. And now in the UK, we have thousands of people every month importing cheap generics at low prices to get access to PrEP if they can't get it through the National Health Service. So that 72 has come down to 15 a month. And every month since then, it's been at about the same level or slightly lower. So what I can say is throwing the kitchen sink at HIV, it really works. And it's worth trying if you possibly can. And I think some people are scared of PrEP. They think that there's a safety issue. And I think part of that, again, it's been drummed up by the pharmaceutical companies. They're trying to get people not to believe in the safety of tenofovir, TDF, and to switch to TAF, which is a patented drug and it's more expensive. We've done a meta-analysis of 13 different randomized trials of PrEP in 22,730 person-years of follow-up. And there's no difference between Truvada and placebo in terms of grade 3 or 4 adverse events, serious adverse events, bone fractures, and serious creatinine elevations. A tiny difference in grade 1 creatinine elevations that have no clinical significance. We've also looked at TDF versus TAF. Again, no difference in grade 1 to 4 clinical adverse events, grade 3 to 4 laboratory adverse events, grade 3 to 4 clinical adverse events, serious adverse events, bone fractures, or discontinuations for renal adverse events. So I think what we're seeing now is there's no need to use expensive treatments if the cheaper ones are just as good. We might actually find this year that TAF is significantly worse tolerated than TDF, which would completely undermine the reason for its use. So just to conclude, I think we shouldn't be too hard on ourselves. You know, we're saying 59%, 22 million people. It's unbelievable. It's a medical miracle. If you said that to anybody else in any other therapeutic area, oh, we've got 59% of people with lung cancer treated or diabetes, they'd bite your arm off. But we've done extremely well, and it's thanks to people like David Cooper and Joop Langer and all the brave, adventurous decisions, all the stuff behind the scenes over the last 20, 30 years that's really made that possible. And you look at the range of countries that have reached these 90-90-90 targets, ranging from Cambodia to the Netherlands to Australia, Swaziland, and there are so many different countries that I think it shows anybody can do it if they have the right political will. There is this group of countries with low HIV prevalence or civil unrest, military conflict, or all of those who need more help. And I think we need to make sure we don't just concentrate on the successes and don't leave any country behind. and make sure there's donor funding to support them. Remember, most of the new HIV infections now and HIV-related deaths are not in these classic African countries. They're in these low prevalence countries with this prevalence below 4.5%. If we don't help them, they're going to become this sub-Saharan Africa of the future. Worldwide, we have to lower HIV infection rates. We're talking about tens of millions of people taking PrEP. In order to prevent one infection, you have to treat between 30 and 40 people. So to prevent 1.8 million infections, we are literally talking about tens of millions. So we need access to extremely low-cost Truvada worldwide. It costs $35 per person per year to make. There's no justification for that price being $20,000 in the United States or $6,000 when it's sold as a patented drug in Europe. So we have to get access to PrEP at low prices. Otherwise, we're just going to be chasing our tails. Every year, we'll put somebody on treatment, somebody else will get infected. Throwing the kitchen sink at HIV is working. Some of these reductions in incidence are just amazing, and we need to see how we can replicate that in a wide range of countries. So just to finish off, this is one of the photos at the end of one of the HIV-NAT retreats, and I'd just like to thank Joop and David, who I've worked with for many years, for all your dedication, all those decisions, all those things you did back in the 1980s and 1990s, without which we simply wouldn't be here today. We've got 22 million people on treatment. It's unbelievable, the progress we've made. But now it's up to us to finish this massive project and achieve treatment for everyone with HIV infection. Thank you very much.